Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us again. It's a great honour to be here. I'm going to introduce our panellists and then start a really interesting debate and conversation about the use of migration statistics. So, first of all, we have Mr. Pietro Mona, Ambassador for Development, Forced Displacement and Migration at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland. We have Ms. Grace Bediako, Acting Director General of National Development Planning Commission in Ghana. Mr. Pedro A. de Alarcon, Head of Big Data for Social Good at Telefonica. Ms. Maruja M.B. Assis, Director of Research and Publications at the Scalabrini Migration Center and co-editor of the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal. And finally, Ms. Kathy Kruger, International Cooperation Office at the Statistics Sweden. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. So my first question is actually for Mr. Pietro Mona. Mr. Mona, as a Swiss... Sorry. You can't hear me? No. Is the Undersecretary General? I'm so sorry. I thought I'd like to. General, I'm so sorry, Mr. Liu. Please come up to the stage. I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, distinguished participants, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this high-level panel on migration statistics, the way forward. I thank the panelists for your participation on this important discussion. I also thank the numerous partners, international agencies and regional commissions for their contribution in formulating the program. My sincere appreciation also goes to the Swiss government for their generous support to this panel. Distinguished guests, let me reiterate the reason we are all gathering here in Dubai this week: to foster technical and political discussions on the opportunities and challenges in producing and using data to facilitate global sustainable development. International migration as a source for prosperity, innovation, and sustainable development has long been recognized. Globally, the number of international migrants reached an estimated figure of 258 million in 2017, up from 173 million in 2000. In 2017, remittance flows to low and mid-income countries reached $466 billion, more than 3 times the amount of ODA they received that year. Remittances constitute a significant source of household income in countries of origin of migrants, improving the situation of their families and the communities. Countries of destination also benefit, since migrants often fill critical labor gaps, create jobs as entrepreneurs, and pay taxes and social security contributions. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by world leaders in 2015, recognizes the important contribution of migration to development. The 2030 Agenda not only sets 10 migration-related targets, but also calls for the more overarching goal that no one is left behind, including migrants. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 years after adoption of 2030 Agenda, the picture for accurate and disaggregated migration data is not optimistic. There is a paucity of basic data on international migration, and existing data are not fully utilized or shared. For example, 17% of countries in Africa and 12% in Asia have not produced official statistics on the number of international migrants since 2005. Producing disaggregated data by migratory status and other important dimensions poses new challenges to the traditional data systems in countries. This calls for the development of new methodologies and data tools. It is not surprising, therefore, that the final draft of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, to be adopted in December this year in Marrakesh, lists as its first objective the collection and utilization of accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policies. I welcome the importance of migration data that was given by the Global Compact. I also welcome the important role given to the United Nations Statistics Commission in harmonizing methodologies and in reviewing regularly a global program to strengthen national capacities to collect, analyze, and disseminate migration data. I'm especially impressed with the openness of the Global Compact negotiation process. Member states repeatedly reached out to the global statistical community for its advice on matters related to migration data. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for the global statistical community to be given such an important task to help generate data for evidence-based policies to achieve safe, orderly, and regular migration. But it is a challenging task. No one party is able to achieve the data objective alone. I see this challenge as an opportunity for all of us to move forward together. I hereby call upon all of you, colleagues from the national statistical systems, policymakers, technology experts from the private sector, researchers, civil society, the donor community, and the regional and global organizations to join this process. Let us move forward together in producing migration data that informs better policy and making migration work for all. I thank you very much for your active participation and wish you have a fruitful discussion. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu. I think those remarks really help to frame our conversation in talking about the opportunities that are available in migration data. Some of them have been missed so far up until now, which we can talk about. So my first question is for Mr. Pietro Mona. Mr. Mona is a Swiss Ambassador for Development, Forced Displacement and Migration. You've been very active in contributing to the intergovernmental negotiation of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration that was finalized in July and will be adopted in December of this year in Morocco. Could you share with us your expectations for the data community on how to improve evidence-based policies on migration?
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. Thank you very much for having invited me to be part of this discussion at the World Data Forum. And with that, I also extend my gratitude to our hosts for this beautiful conference and the venue here. I think I'll come back to one of the points that I made, is the question of intertwining various sectors. I'm not a statistician. I don't work at our Federal Office for Statistics. I am a migration guy. I work on migration issues, but I think this is exactly one of the points, and I will come back, of importance to bring in various sectors so that also the data world is better interconnected with various sectors, in this case migration. But let me start with some reflections on migration. I think migration is probably one of the subjects that has the biggest delta between people who have an opinion and people who have an evidence-based opinion. Or to put it otherwise, in other words, there's a lot of misperception and misinformation around migration issues in our public and political discourse in various regions of the world. And this shapes the way that we look at migrants, this shapes the way the policies are being formulated, and this shapes the way that we address the opportunities, but also the challenges of migration. In that sense, I think it is particularly important to have today also this debate on the role that data, statistics, the statistical community can contribute to rephrase maybe the narrative around migration. It's not about making migration only positive, only negative. Migration has both sides. And in particular, because migration is such a complex issue, because there is no clear-cut answer, because migration can be enormously beneficial for families, for individuals, for societies, for countries, but it can also carry a lot of hardship. It can also have a lot of negative sides. And because of this complexity, the issue of having an evidence-based discussion that is based on data and statistics and evidence is even more so important. Now, the Undersecretary General has already mentioned the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and there are various ways to go about what this Global Compact is. I like to tie it neatly with the 2030 Agenda. In the 2030 Agenda, if you go through, you won't find that often the word migration. There is one particular target, this target 10.7, that speaks explicitly about safe, orderly, and regular migration. And I gather from my colleagues that work on statistics that that target has been a bit of a nightmare for the Statistical Commission. Because how do you measure safe, orderly, and regular migration? What does it even mean? How do you go about it? What are the indicators to measure 10.7? And to make a big jump, I think to some extent, the Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration is a translation of Target 10.7, is a translation of what the international community understands to be parameters to ensure that migration in the future can be safer, more orderly, more regular for the migrants and for the societies that are involved. So I see a clear link between the 2030 Agenda and the Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration. Now, the Global Compact is also a 360-degree vision on migration. It has 23 objectives and a list of actions that countries and governments can voluntarily use to achieve these objectives. It is a 360-degree vision because it talks about every and all aspects of migration, from data to the root causes of migration, to labor mobility, to integration, to border management, to human rights and migration, to integration issues, to migration development, and many other aspects. So it is in that sense the first time that we have a comprehensive UN document that was negotiated amongst 192 countries that lays out a vision on how migration should look in the future. Now you asked me the question and I get to that now. So the question is now, we are at a few weeks before this Global Compact is going to be adopted in Marrakesh. And the question that was raised was, what can the data community contribute, maybe also for the implementation of the Global Compact? Now I have 3 points. I get 3 points that may not necessarily be completely new to the statistics community, I imagine, but I'll try to link it up to concrete examples from the migration field. The first is obvious. Be part of the public and political discourse around migration. Engage with that discourse. It is, in many countries of the world, a very hard-fought debate, but I think data and statistics can bring in the clarity, the evidence needed to dissect between false information and misperceptions and show what actually the reality should look like. There are a lot of good initiatives already out there that look at this intertwining between public and political discourse and data. The StatCom is certainly one that does a lot of work also to reaching out with statistics, with information about many issues, including on migration. 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago, the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, an initiative by the IOM and hosted by the German government, was launched in Berlin and has since then done a ton of work on looking at data around migration issues. But there is one particular initiative that I would like to highlight here, and it's an initiative that has brought together McKinsey, the McKinsey company, with the IOM and the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General of International Migration. McKinsey has already published, I think 2 years ago, a report that has highlighted, among other things, that the 3.4% the migrants that represent 3.4% of the global population contributes around 9% of the global GDP. These are the kind of numbers that we need also to to shape the narrative. Building on that and building on the work that IOM has done, McKinsey, IOM, and the OSRSG are now looking into on how to better measure what it means to implement the Global Compact. What is the impact for governments, for societies, to implement the Global Compact, to put a number on it, to say, if you do that, this can have X, Y, Z impact on your GDP, for example. But they also try to measure what it would mean not to do, what it would mean not to implement the Global Compact from a GDP point of view, for example, but also, for example, from a point of view of social security. So this is, I think, a very good example of intertwining data, statistics, the work that is being done in that field with a public discourse and a political discourse that is incredibly important. The second call would be go beyond numbers and be aware of the impact. Now, some of you in the room may have actually worked on migration issues, and you may have heard of the migration hump. The migration hump basically states that up until about a GDP per capita of $10,000, a country has, on average, an emigration rate, an increasing emigration rate. So there is the hump that goes up. Once a country reaches about $10,000 GDP per capita, that emigration rate goes down. This has had a major impact on many public and political discourses in countries like Switzerland, where we actually look at how development and sustainable development can have an impact on migration flows. Then the critics come, yeah, but if you are actually contributing to increase the GDP per capita in countries of origin, you will actually increase the outflow of migrants from that country. Now, the migration hump has an enormous amount of flaws, in my view. First of all, GDP per capita is not a very good and reliable measurement of development. And the migration hump also doesn't measure what kind of immigration we're talking about. Is it irregular migration? Is it regular migration? Is it forced displacement? It doesn't qualify that. It also doesn't look at the net migration, so looking at how much emigration and immigration there is in one country. So in that sense, the migration hump is a good example of moving beyond numbers and being aware of the impact that a statistical analysis like the migration hump can have on a public discourse. Be critical of what you are producing and be aware of the impact that it has on such a delicate and complex discussion around migration. And the last point is branch out to other partners and sectors. And we will hear more about from the panels on how also, for example, the private sector can contribute enormously to create data around migration issues. And the private sector has for many years been absent, unfortunately, in the discussion around migration issues, whereas we know that we can't discuss about migration, labor mobility without the private sector. But we also look now at issues like big data, and the panel before us was just looking at that issue and how the private sector contribute. But we also have to branch out to other sectors. And this is, again, where the 2030 agenda comes in. If you look at migration and you only stick to target 10.7 of the 2030 agenda, you have a very narrow view of what migration actually means for sustainable development and what sustainable development means for migration. So I think when we look at what kind of data can be produced around migration issues, we should also look at what kind of data is being produced, for example, around gender equality. And can we there include the issue of migrant women, for example, in the data that we are collecting around gender equality? Because migration and migrants play a critical role also for the achievement of SDG 5. They play an incredibly important role also for the achievement of SDG 1 and 2, or the one on health. A work that we have done together with the Overseas Development Institute has looked at and find interlinkages between migration, basically every and all SDGs. So this is the call, that if you're looking at how to generate data on any of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is there a possibility also to include migration into that, so that we multiply actually the data that is being generated that we can use then to shape the public discourse around migration, which is critically needed so that in the future migration can be safer, more regular, and more orderly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I particularly appreciate the emphasis on the interplay between the political discourse and the public discourse, because I guess that's where I, as a journalist, come in, is about the connection between the two. But I want to get to our other speakers on the panel with another question. Each of you represents a community that is part of the global system that helps in improving migration data. I would like to ask the speakers from their perspectives, what are the priorities in improving migration data and in improving the use of migration data for policy making, especially with the unprecedented data requirement under the SDG era? Perhaps we could start with you, Ms. Bediako. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel. Ghana's medium-term development policy framework is a strategy document that guides the sectors and the districts to develop plans for their implementation. The current one focuses on an agenda for jobs, creating prosperity and equal opportunity. And we have in that plan a policy area which is population management and migration for development. And some key strategies that we have include improving the economy of rural districts to curb rural-urban migration, promoting initiatives to transform brain drain into brain gain, leveraging remittances for national development, creating an enabling environment for the return of Ghanaian migrants and their reintegration, and several others. Clearly, we can see that our need for data is much broader than just distinguishing between who are migrants or measuring the migrant population. We have mapped the SDG targets to the various strategies, and we find goal 8, 16, goal 8, 10, 16, and 17 are quite prominent. But key among them, the strategies, is to develop a database of Ghanaian diaspora and strengthen migration data and information management systems. Clearly, there's not enough data to respond to the SDGs, much less the national planning needs. For all the migration-related indicators of the SDGs, we have assessed that 31% are already compiled, 46% are not compiled at all, and 23% are classified as Tier 3, but relevant for our purpose. Moreover, the SDGs require that several indicators are disaggregated by migration status and other characteristics. So when we look at the various sources, we see population register, which needs to be continuously updated, will provide the basic information for cross-classifying the various variables, and with the possibility of linking other records. Without the links, it is going to be difficult to use such a source. Statistical inquiries such as population censuses and sample surveys, those are the most common sources that we have at our countries. But then we see that, again, there are serious limitations there. And then the border records, which are not quite well developed. But when we come to administrative data, we find that there are many different agencies in charge of different aspects of migration. You have, for example, the Ghana Immigration Service records entries and departures from their migration cards at the entry points, border posts, airports, and harbors. Then we have the Labor Department, which is supposed to register labor migrants and produce employment statistics. We also have Bank of Ghana, which has official remittances, and Ghana missions abroad, processing visa, and other agencies. And these all form part of the bigger data system that we should have, but they are very separate. There are a lot more agencies, about 16 of them, and all doing different things. The priority then is how to integrate the different administrative data sources so that they begin to speak about migration and the different elements that will lend itself to policy interventions. We need, for example, in this process to also be able to standardize forms that are used, ensure that the systems are interoperable and data generated are usable and disseminated adequately. In Ghana, we think that the population register has potential, but we have just started a national identification system with the hope that down the line, when the first canvassing is done and the database is established, then we look at different areas where we can bring other sources together and continuously update the database so that population registers can provide more information on how we manage the migration. So basically, we believe that in the medium term, short to medium term, the idea is to look at the administrative data systems and bring them together to have a coherent system in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Alakon?
Okay, so for our case, coming from the private sector, I consider myself as representing the telco industry because we are pretty much on the same page. The telco industry was focusing, let's say, 10 years ago on providing connectivity to the world. Still, we do. So, you know, the 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G, and we are all racing for getting connectivity in all the territories in the world. But suddenly we realized that in our hands we had a data business. The data in the telco industry was the thing coming out from the exhaust pipe outside the business. So it was not value at all. It was deleted. In Telefonica, some years ago, data was deleted. And suddenly we discovered something to change the company internally, to generate a new business, and also to give the data back to the society. So this is what we do in our team. And the first priority we set is to evangelize and to tell people what is telco data now. Because when people come to us and ask for telco data, they think of CDRs, call detailed records, and text messages, and that's all. But actually, if we go to, we see this slide, what we have now is a sensing network in every country where we are. In the case of Colombia, for example, I have a case study there. We have 14 million people generating data every day, every hour, every minute. Because we are not considering only the calls and the text messages. Every signaling that is produced by a cell phone when you are in a journey is being captured by the network. So that means in terms of migration that we can capture very well with high quality data and with a very large sample the dwells of the people and the journeys of the people. And that is important to tell because, in fact, this is allowing us to create like a dynamic census. So we know where people sleep during the night, over the days, in long periods and short periods. We are working, for example, with UNICEF for monitoring disasters and disaster response. So one question that we can answer is where after a big earthquake, where people are sleeping the day after, which is a key question actually. But also we can answer the same question for a longer period. But the telco industry is selling now other services. We are selling TV services. We are selling mobile payments as well. And we can learn a lot from this activity. For example, analyzing the TV audiences of those people having a TV package, we can find families with children or without children. And that is fairly easy to do. Of course, we can find other factors, and we can easily enter into ethical problems. For example, we could detect the political sign of a family. But, and this is something we can be very cautious. So the first priority was to show everybody the power of telco data as a high-quality data, the granularity we can reach. We can go to the level of the district of a city. So from national to district is a lot of granularity. We go in the time to the level of minutes, and now we are working to provide this in real time, which is the challenge, the technical challenge we are facing now. So when we are working around migrations, we have like two lines of priorities. One is about the methodology aspect. And for example, we made this case study for migrations due to climate change in Colombia. And we got the data from 14 million people. And we detected a cluster of 13,000 people that likely migrate internally due to severe drought in the north of the country. But this is something that we did by ourselves, and we need to add more methodology and more sources, and including other telco operators, to the data sets. So that is critical. We need to sit down with the statistical offices and create a common methodology, common naming convention for indicators. What is a journey? What is a dwell? And put it for the industry, not only for the telcos, but other industry, for example, providing GPS data, in order to be all in the same page. On the operational aspect, what people, I think, want is not data, but they want answers to questions. So we are working hard to define those questions beforehand, and not to share. We don't favor sharing data as it is, raw data. We want to share data plus intelligence, which is insights. So we put together the data and the algorithms, and what we provide to agencies is a service. So this is the operational part, and if we are going to provide a service, we need to be sustainable in time, which is really a challenge. So yeah, pretty much.
Okay. This wasn't actually on my list of questions, but I wanted to follow up. What about public trust? When you say things like, we know where you sleep, I'm sure that might be quite frightening to some of your customers, right? Yeah,
exactly. So that is a challenge. How, I didn't mention regulation, but it's in all the talks I've been today. Regulation, public trust as a company. Elena Alfaro in the talk before was telling a ground truth is our problem is not only legal, it's only a problem of trust. But I think our responsibility is to show the society, to be transparent, and to show the data we have from them. Because it's their data, it's not Telefonica or telco data, it's their data, we just keep them for them in a secure way. But and we have a very big project in the company for everybody who wants to download the data and to know what Telefonica knows about you. It's easy for you to download, same as other companies. But people shouldn't be scared as long as you inform why you keep this data internally and what is the use you are putting into this data. That is the key. But you know, all companies in internet are capturing scary data from us, so there shouldn't be a problem as long as you are transparent to your customers.
Thank you. Ms. Assis, perhaps?
Thank you, Mona. Well, first, as a researcher, of course, I'm very much delighted by the fact that the objective of improving migration data and using it for policy making is included in the 23 objectives of the Global Compact. When we consider the situation about migration data, I think what we have is a very mixed picture. We do have to acknowledge that we are not starting from scratch. In fact, there had been significant steps that have been taken, and various recommendations have been made on how to improve migration data. And a very important source of reference for this are the recommendations that were drafted by the United Nations in 1998. And what I find very interesting is that some 20 or 30 years later, more recently in 2017, the Global Migration Group under the World Bank's NOMAD project produced the handbook for improving the production and use of migration data for development. I see there some kind of a development because in the earlier set of recommendations, it was basically about data collection systems. But in current discussions, the current discussions now include the production and use of migration data for a certain purpose, and that is to link it with development. And also in terms of sharing and dissemination of international migration data, particularly at the global level, the work of the UNDESA, the Migration Data Portal of the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, and NOMAD's Migration Portal, among others, have also been very significant contributions. But while migration data are indeed available and are produced by relevant government agencies, when we come down to the national level, we also note very notable and persisting gaps and challenges, including different definitions of who is to be counted as an international migrant, the lack of sex disaggregated data, and the issue of timeliness, among others. So I think if we look at the picture at the national level, I think it would be useful for countries which have not done it yet. It would be useful to carry out a mapping or a review of migration data and statistics produced by different government agencies. For individual countries, this would be very key and critical to identifying definitions and parameters that are used, identifying strengths and gaps in the collection, not only in the collection, but in the whole process of production. That means also looking into the processing of data that have been collected, looking also at the aspect of dissemination, storage, use of data, and of course, data protection issues. Since many government agencies, many governments rather, produce census data, administrative data, and migration-related households surveys, I think there's also a need to have a second level of stock taking, and that would be to identify for the different countries what do we know about migration and what we need to know and understand about migration, its determinants and consequences over time, what other sources of data and types of data are needed. And for questions such as this, it would require drafting a migration research agenda. And I guess we could even extend that on the part of policymakers, it would also include drafting also policy concerns, key policy concerns for which probably research-based evidence would be needed. When it comes to improving the use of migration data for policy making, I think I'd like to start first with the views and attitudes to migration data, particularly among policymakers. It's very important to have a sense of the value of migration data, because if migration data are valued as inputs to sound policy making, if they are valued and if they are considered as a public good, then investing in the production and use of quality data would make very good sense. Also, because of the multifaceted character of international migration, it really requires the whole of government approach. And what this means is more coordination between and among the different government agencies that produce migration-related data. And I would also expand this a bit further by emphasizing a multi-stakeholder approach to policy discussions. No? For example, I think in many countries, many governments have made significant steps in terms of forming interagency coordination. But for the most part, interagency coordination is still very much governmental. I think such types of coordination would benefit from, for example, consultations and conversations that include the academic community and other stakeholders to identify what are critical at different phases of policy development, policy monitoring, and policy evaluation. And I think also for the research and academic community, considering the current environment, data environment, where information is easily accessible and there are various sources of information on migration, research-based evidence now competes with a great variety of information, including fake news. So I think as producers and users of migration data, the academic community needs to make conscious efforts to communicate key findings and discuss policy implications with policymakers. So what this would require is, this would entail communicating research-based reports in accessible language and finding different pathways as well as different platforms for dialogues. Thank you.
And finally, Ms. Kruger.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, just to say thank you to the organizers for this interesting conference and for the opportunity to take part in this panel. As we've heard, we've seen in recent years a significant rise in the need to develop migration statistics, and this is mainly due to the large number of policy developments seen in the area of migration. And this may be because of the requirements under Agenda 2030, or maybe just because of a realization that migration is a fundamental aspect of our global world. In the last 2 to 3 years in Africa, for example, we've seen an enormous political will to develop policies and actions to improve the situation for migrants. We've already heard about the Global Compact. We can also mention the Joint Labour Migration Programme, the Migration Policy Framework for Africa, just to mention a few. But as is often the case, once the policy frameworks are in place, we realize that we can't implement the policies without first having an idea of the current status of the issue, in this case migration, of where the challenges are, the success stories, what's happening over time. And this is really in order to identify exactly what needs to be done and where in order to achieve the policies that have been put in place. So we've seen this increased focus on developing migration statistics in order to make progress in the implementation of these policy initiatives, to follow up on the initiatives and to understand the issues even better. Migration is quite unique because it touches on a wide variety of domains, such as the development of the population, the economy, labor markets, the exploitation of natural resources, human rights, and conflict management, and I'm sure I've forgotten quite a few. It crosses country borders, it crosses jurisdictions, it can be politically sensitive, particularly in the cases of conflict-driven migration. So I think in terms of priorities for us as statisticians, we need to increase our understanding of what lies behind the conflicting definitions and the interpretations of what constitutes a migrant, what delimits migration, and therefore try to identify what exactly we need to measure in order to help the policymakers. We need to understand that migration is by its very nature constantly changing and evolving, and that we need to be both flexible and clear and coherent in our application of these definitions. We also need to develop an understanding of the national and regional context to increase dialogue with migration experts, so to cross these boundaries between statisticians and policymakers, which we've already discussed quite a few sessions today, to understand why people are moving, where people are moving, and what impact the moving has on both the origin and the destination. So that's, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So for the next question, I wanted to ask each of the speakers if you could share one key lesson learned in your past work on better migration data for policy. And perhaps before I pass over to Mr. Mona, I'm going to break protocol for a second and perhaps share my own experiences of developing better migration data for policy. So before I became a journalist, I was actually working for the International Organization for Migration in their monitoring and evaluation department. And I wanted to leave that world and go to journalism, in part because I was very frustrated about the way that statistics on migration were being collected and disseminated. I felt that the way that they were being collected created feedback loops, so the migrants and refugees themselves weren't able to question the statistics that we were collecting and weren't able to read them and to understand them and to question them, and also that they were being shared in a very, very small group of people that kind of had a feedback loop. So I felt that moving into journalism would help to create a bit more accountability for some of those organisations. But we can talk about that later. I'd be interested to hear from Mr. Mona about better migration data for policy. It's a big question.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it speaks to many of the points that were raised already. For example, the question of trust, the question of what we're talking about. So is it international migration? Is it internal migration? Is it urbanization? Is it displacement, climate-induced displacement, for example? And I think that the variation there also have to be clearly articulated. And indeed, this is also where the media plays an incredible important role. Unfortunate, with some few exceptions, not necessarily the best role, if I may dare to say, because they get also swept up in this narrative of using terminologies that are, for example, legally not correct, like climate refugees. Refugees is a clearly demarked terminology of a person protected under the Geneva Convention. And there is also the problem of dealing with numbers, for example. In the discussion now around the Global Compact, including in Switzerland, for example, this number that also the Undersecretary General has mentioned of 258 million migrants worldwide has been picked up by a lot of media outlets, right? But it was quickly turned into there are 250 million people on the move. So potentially there are 258 million people coming to Switzerland tomorrow. And hence, it's going to be the end of Switzerland if we subscribe to this Global Compact, for example. And this is how a statistical figure quickly turns into a populist narrative, for example. If you're not careful about what we are talking about. I just looked up again the numbers. Just by making a difference, for example, between, and again, I'm not an expert in statistics, but between the difference between flow and stock, you can already change quite dramatically the narrative. Because if it is true that the stock of migration has grown regularly over the last 20, 30 years, the flow of migrants has actually gone up and down over the last 20, 30 years. So it's not true that we are necessarily living now in a time where there's the highest number of mobile migrants, and mean of flow of migrants. It is true that we have never had as many migrants as a stock, but the flow is already different. And I think these are nuances that have to be part of this narrative. So the example is also, I mean, I worked 4 years at the ECOWAS Commission in West Africa, for example, a couple of years back, and it was sort of a vague where we did, together with the IOM, a lot of migration profiles, for example. So many, including Ghana, for example, back in, I think, 2010-11, together with the IOM and the ECOWAS Commission, we developed a migration profile of Ghana, trying to figure out what does it mean, how much immigration, emigration, remittances, and all these factors. But we have encountered many of the problems that you have mentioned. Migration is so intertwined with so many different sectors that you can't simply just look at the person entering the border, for example. Plus, in West Africa, what does border mean, and who actually enters, and who is getting registered, and how is that person being registered? And I think the interesting part of the migration profile was actually to get to a point where all these questions were raised. Unfortunately, we couldn't move much further, because then from a migration profile, the next step would have been to actually then develop and to enshrine that idea of a migration profile into capacity building modules, for example, into a whole of government approach, where I fully agree It has also from a data perspective, it's absolutely critical to have a whole of government approach. And then from there then to develop actual migration policies, and when I say migration policies, not only sort of immigration policies, but again, looking at, for example, what does migration mean for a health policy of Ghana? Or what does it mean for an integration policy, social security policy? All this mainstream migration into all these various policy sectors is extremely important. And we always come back to the point, if we don't understand what we're talking about, if we don't have the data, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to understand that migration is a critical factor in so many policies that we're dealing with, and hence the importance of continuing this discussion with all of you.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to come to the issue of coordination. Ghana, in 2016, we developed the National Policy on Migration, and with a plan which was supposed to be implemented. We also looked at a strategy to implement this plan. But the strategy was based on a comprehensive review of the migration-producing or data-producing agencies for migration. And there were 16 institutions that were assessed. There were substantial gaps in the data and then overlaps in policies, which led to a strategy document for Ghana Integrated Migration Management Approach. It was a project funded by EU. One of the key objectives was to strengthen coordination among stakeholders. The issue there is we identified the Ministry of Interior and the Ghana Statistical Service to coordinate the effort of data collection. And then there were some technical committees set up, also dissemination committee. But somehow, progress has stalled. Now, so it raises the question, how does one effectively coordinate such efforts? A lot went into preparing this project, and thought went into choosing the coordinators for one policy angle and then the statistics. But it didn't seem to work. Now, what we take from there is maybe we have to have an institution that drives it. And the question is, for us, as National Development Planning Commission, we have always looked at, in our monitoring, we have looked at the end, the output. And more, we see that for some of these broad initiatives, we need to be looking at also monitoring the process so that we can follow what is happening, whether what has been proposed is working or not. So with the coordination, we see that a lot of agencies can be involved. We have to bring people together. The key policy and statistics institutions may lead, but somehow we have to be able to monitor and make sure that we are able to implement our strategies, which I think from here we will have to go back and look at it again and try to retrace our steps. That's a big lesson for us.
Yeah, for our case, when considering telco data and all that we can offer in order to study migrations, we found good news is that technically it's easy. So it's not, we have been facing other projects, other use cases like epidemics, much more complex at the level of the data. But what is difficult here, and this is the key lesson that we learned, is that it is also very easy to come into political issues and conflicts with government when investigating and providing data related to migrations. A lot of migrations, you know, are motivated by conflict or economic situation or political persecution, for example. So as a company, we need to take care of the image, the brand. We need to calm down a lot of people before we have the okay to go ahead with the project. So it means not only make a safe project for the users and or customers, but also to make a safe project to the company, to the private sector. And this is the key lesson we learned. So this is why we carefully pick what countries are ready to go for in these cases. And we try to look for not only trust from the statistical offices, but also empathy. They need to understand what issues we can easily enter and be sensitive to those issues. So, and then it comes the rest of the things, sharing data, putting methodology, indicators, putting this in a sustainable basis so we can create like a long-term relationship with agencies. But the key lessons is to how to calm down everybody before starting to work with a country.
I think for the research community, it's really a challenge. How do we translate findings with policy implications into actual policy implications? And it's interesting that many years ago, there was a research that was conducted in several countries in Asia. And the major finding of that study was that it's really more the advocacy issues, the issues that are raised by civil society organizations and NGOs that seem to get the attention of policymakers rather than research-based evidence. Okay? Several years ago, our center had the opportunity to do a study interrogating the links between migration and development. And for this particular study, we partnered with a government agency, the Commission on Filipinos Overseas. And I think that decision to partner with a government agency in conducting the research in the Philippines proved to be quite valuable because, of course, after many series of research dissemination fora and workshops, still we were wondering, well, what would be the impact of this study, especially with the current discussions on migration and development, and also the challenges in a country like the Philippines where when it comes to labor migration, the migration governance system is in place, but there was also a sense of discontent and dissatisfaction that there was some disconnect between migration and development. And in fact, this particular study did identify several key disconnects between migration and development. One disconnect is that our labor migration policies are not really linked to our development policies. And so there was also a disconnect between migration-related agencies and development agencies in the country. And a very important disconnect as well is the disconnect between the national framework and what happens at the level of local governments. What was interesting about that study is that I think that study did contribute to some of the changes in policy discourses in the Philippines, because in the last two development plan, the Philippine Development Plan for 2011 and 2016, and the succeeding one for 2017 and 2022, many aspects about international migration have been integrated in different chapters of the Philippine Development Plan. And also an interesting development is the fact that the National Economic and Development Authority also created a pathway for, or a specific subcommittee to deal with migration and development. I think what helped in this process is the fact that our government partner continued the advocacy among government agencies. If it was just us, a research center and the research community, perhaps we won't be able to have the same traction. So it was very important to have a focal government agency that would continue the advocacy and that would continue to knock on the doors of several government agencies to level up the discussion on migration and development. So the key lesson there is that we need other partners. I cannot overemphasize the importance of continuing dialogue and partnership, including key government agencies.
Thank you. I have two aspects maybe I'd like to bring up here. Firstly, I feel that we really need to embrace data integration as a concept and as a reality. I agree with my colleagues on the panel that the only way forward is to use data from different sources, different surveys, censuses, but also administrative data, records data, big data, to put together these different types of data. But then what we need to consider in terms of statistical capacity development is that we need to improve the capacity to identify, to evaluate, describe, and adapt these different types of data so that they can really work together in a robust and transparent way. So I was very happy to hear my colleague from Telefonica talking about methodology and talking to the statistical offices, because that's the way that we see it as well. I think primarily we need to be able to evaluate and describe the quality of the different types of data to make sure that they suit the purpose of use and that the data can be used maybe to illustrate a situation, but as long as we understand the limitations of the data set that we're using and how they can work together. Secondly, I think we need to improve our understanding of migration as a phenomenon and to stop thinking in terms of one agency, one country, one nation, one system. We need to realize that migration can't be confined to one institution or one level of governance, as you mentioned. And it's both a local issue in terms of services and welfare, it's a national issue, it's a cross-border issue, a regional issue, and a global issue. So that's what we really need to use and develop these existing structures for cooperation where they exist. In terms of the lessons learned, Statistics Sweden is currently embarking on a different kind of project with migration statistics in Africa. I would say the majority of our traditional projects are focusing on bilateral partnerships between statistical offices, so ourselves and our NSI in our partner country. But more and more we're seeing the need to broaden the perspective of our projects to other national producers, to users, to international organizations, and to regional corporations, really to see the progress in developing statistics that we need to see. And this is especially in areas such as migration statistics, which, as we've seen, is cross-border, cross-nation, cross-organization issue. The new project is focusing on developing regional capacities so that they can in turn work regionally with their member states in order to develop the capacity in member states. So I suppose that's the key lesson learned of our 30 years in working in capacity development, is that in order to really see the true impact of the statistics we're helping to develop in our partner countries, we need to work more broadly with all the various actors in a statistical system and maybe even outside of a statistical system to make sure that the statistics are coherent and relevant and can be used in the most effective way.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running low on time, so I'm just going to ask one quick question to each of you now, which is to share how you would like to contribute to improving migration data and in using migration data for policy making going forward. It's very similar to lessons learned in some ways. If there was one key takeaway to improve migration data.
Should I go?
Yeah?
All right. Well, actually, I mean, many things have already been said, but picking up on something that I just want to stress that I didn't mention on my own is the importance also to look at the data and statistic capacities of local actors. Migration is inherently a local issue. It happens in cities, it happens at the local level. and to better understand what kind of social, economic, cultural impact migration has. And again, both positive and mainly positive, but also the negative sides. I think the next step after all the steps that have already been mentioned, an important step is also to look at the capacities at the local level, so that also cities understand what their policies, what kind of impact they have. And I think cities do have often a much more developed understanding of the importance of migration policies, because they are affected on a daily basis with the direct interaction between citizens and migrants. But a big gap is certainly on the statistics and data capacities to reach the granularity also at the local level, and to capacitate also cities in being part of this discourse around migration data.
Yeah. I think I'll consider it at two levels. One at the national level, where we need to be able to implement a policy, a comprehensive policy framework, which actually helps to both manage migration itself and also data governing migration. The other aspect is the international. A lot of our countries depend on international standards and the guidelines. And many of us also have the primary sources of most of our data being population census, some household surveys. So some work on basic questions beyond the foreign-born and nationality questions would help us to better estimate the migration, at least stock. And here, I think, to the extent that pilot work is being undertaken, we would be prepared also to be involved in that at that level.
Yes. For the case of Telefonica, we believe we represent the Latin America, Central America community, which is around 300 million people. And we would like to contribute by actually providing this data to the offices and all these experts, investigating them and researching and providing measurements and understanding on migration. But I would like to also highlight the role of the GSMA, the Association of Telco Operators, because they are leveraging and scaling these efforts to all countries in the world. They have the connectivity for most of the operators in the world. So the work that we are doing in South America could be easily scaled to Africa or Asia or other geographies, and put in common this value that we have, which is mobile data. If you take a look at the potential data sources to track migration flows, there are little sources with such a massive sample, quality, and the ability to pinpoint when the migration happens and where it happens, where are the origin countries, destination countries, and profiles. So I want to put the value there. I offer Telefonica to contribute more on this for Latin America.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the value of the research community is really in the area also of assessment, because of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's just a diversity of data sources and also actors producing data. So at a certain point, it's still very important to assess the kind of data that we are getting, to consider the sources, to consider the limitations, as well as the prospects for better quality data. And I'd also like to follow up on the point that was made by our colleague here about the importance of the regional level, because I think also at the regional level, there's also a great deal of potential there in terms of cooperation, particularly perhaps because they share the same region and also similar histories as well as similar context. Maybe the possibility also for cooperation, for capacity development would also be stronger, and the regional level would also be a good nodal point between the global the national and the local.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think the thing I would like to take away is this idea of cooperation, but in a kind of controlled manner. So I think it's very important to develop these frameworks, especially legal frameworks in forms of data sharing and the mandate to coordinate and to cooperate. But really, I think the project that we're embarking on in Africa, it's really focusing on building networks at all the different levels. It's using the cooperation forms that already exist to try to build the discussion about migration, about the definitions, about what's happening in the different countries and at the different levels. And then also, of course, identifying new methods and new data sources and so on. But in order for that to happen, we really need to build this, this cooperation at all levels between all parties. So it's a high ambition. We'll see.
Absolutely. But that's what this conference is for, right? So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel one more time. Thank you.